For a summer party in your back garden, there's one drink above all that's going to be in demand. For me, and for countless other people, beer is the best long drink in the world, and it has been for centuries. Beer is brewed and drunk all over the world. Now, of course, I think that British beer is best, but that would be cheerfully disputed by brewers and by drinkers in Germany and Belgium and Holland and Czechoslovakia and as far away as Australia. But what is certain is that British beers are among the finest in the world, and what is beyond dispute is that Britain brews a greater variety of beers than any other country. We are spoiled for choice. Lagers and ales, bitter and mild and brown, stouts and barley wines, beers imported, beers made from imported recipes. Above all, though, you'll find the traditional beer brewed in Britain. Most of the beer comes from the breweries of the established brewing companies. They have more than 100 breweries, and they all brew a very wide range of beers. But there are also around 100 very small breweries, and several dozen pubs brew their own beer. Has brewing changed over the centuries? Well, no, not really. You see, it can't. Oh, modern beer is of a more consistently high quality than it used to be, but that's because the modern brewer knows more about the processes. He understands them better now, and therefore he can monitor them, and he can control them with greater reliability and precision. But the processes are still natural processes, and the ingredients are still natural ingredients, as they've always been. There are only 4 main ingredients: water, which must be of the right quality; malted barley, which gives beer its strength and most of its flavour; hops, which give beer its characteristic bitterness and aroma; and yeast, which is the fermenting agent. We'll start with barley. Other grains can be used in the brewing of beer: wheat, maize, rice. But in Britain, the overwhelming preference is for barley. It grows well here and has proved an ideal basic material for the brewer. But the brewer cannot use the barley as it comes straight from the farms. It has to be malted. This is barley straight from the field. The barley corn has a hard husk. It's like a little food store. Inside each one is the starch and the protein, but it's no use to the brewer like that because he can't get at it. It's as if the store was locked. What he needs is this. This is malted barley. The germination has begun. It's beginning to release the protein, to release the goodness. And then it's been stopped, that process, by the application of heat and rapid drying. And that is the art of the maltster. I wonder what this tastes like. It's nice. Like the stuff your mum used to give you when you were little to make sure you grew. In this maltings, you see the modern large-scale way of making malt. First, the grain is steeped in water by bath and shower and jacuzzi. A plant like this will make some 80,000 tons of malt a year. An individual batch will take a little longer than a week to produce. After steeping, the grain is passed on to the next floor. Here, in the right conditions of temperature and humidity, the grain begins to germinate. At precisely the right moment, the maltster arrests this germination by drying the grains in a kiln. He has turned barley into malt. It's now ready for the brewers. We shall begin in a small brewery because it's easier to understand the processes. This one, like so many, was founded more than a century ago. And this one, like so many, doesn't use tap water or even rainwater. It uses water from a spring or from a well. In fact, from a well. And this is it. But like all breweries, it adjusts the salts and the minerals in the water. And that process is called Burtonization. And it means simply bringing the water up to the standard of the original spring water at Burton-on-Trent, the centre of British brewing. Oh, and incidentally, they don't call it water, they call it liquor. The daily routine of the small brewery is built around the preparation of the mash. On the day before, the malt will be fed into hoppers and then coarsely crushed in a mill, just enough to break the husks. The kind of malt being used depends on the brewer's recipe. Lighter malts for lagers, darker malts for ales, roasted malts for stouts. First thing in the morning, the liquor and the ground malt, now called grist, are brought together in the mash tun. Everything has been carefully measured and the liquor heated up to exactly the temperature required. The only other product likely to be added at this stage is a small amount of unmalted grain, commonly wheat or maize. This may help make up for any inconsistencies in the malt, but it will also adjust the flavour according to the particular recipe. Now, what's going on in there? Well, think of the mash tun as a kind of gigantic teapot gently stewing. People talk about, let's brew some tea. Well, it's the same process, except that takes about an hour and a half, and the liquor gradually absorbs the goodness of the malt. Strictly in chemical terms, the enzymes have been reactivated. The process that was halted at the end of the malting has started up again to convert the starch into sugars and produce a sweet malty extract called wort. Like grist, wort is an Anglo-Saxon word, a reminder that people have been brewing beer for centuries, since long before they ever knew about enzymes. The wort is drawn off slowly through a filter at the bottom of the mash tun. The wort has not only extracted the sugar, it has also extracted some colour. More liquor is sprayed onto the grist to extract all the sugars possible. This is called sparging. The wort may not taste like beer yet, but it is beginning to look like it. From now on, too, other natural sugars can be added to augment the wort. What kind, what quantity, depends on the recipe. A large modern brewery will get to the same stage a bit faster. The mash tun may be bigger, but that's the only difference. The ingredients are the same, but the filters can be separate. In this brewery, it's a succession of filters.
Control room.
The control of the processes is entirely automatic, but don't forget that it was brewers who established this control, and brewers who keep an eye open to make sure that everything is happening correctly. After the wort has been pumped through them, the filters are even cleaned automatically. And by separating and accelerating the filtration, the brewers can start a fresh mash every 2 hours or so. And nothing is wasted. The used grain, which still has a lot of protein left in it, goes back to the farms as food for cattle, one of the many links between brewing and agriculture. So now we come to the next stage in making beer, which happens in that copper, where the wort is boiled with hops. The hop is a pretty odd kind of plant. There are only a few areas of Britain where it grows successfully. Kent is the most famous, but Hereford and Worcester are also important. The hop climbs like a vine and can be trained up strings and wires. It grows vigorously like a weed. You can even see it wild in the hedgerows. And in the autumn, the hop cones mature. For centuries, hop cones were little used. It was only slowly that ancient brewers came to appreciate that distinctive bitter tang and aroma they added. The Flemish introduced hops to Britain in the Middle Ages. By the end of the 16th century, they had become a regular constituent of British beer. Fuggles and Goldings, Yeoman and Bramling Cross, Wye, Challenger and Target. Today's 12 main strains of hop have been carefully selected, bred and cultivated. And the picking is less labour-intensive. London's East Enders used to do it. Now they holiday in Spain instead. The cones nowadays are stripped by machines. As soon as possible, they must be dried. In Kent, this was traditionally done in oast houses. Then the dried hops are pressed into pockets and bales for sending to the brewer. They weigh next to nothing, light as feathers, but they smell delicious. The aroma comes from the oils, the bitterness from the resins, and when they're boiled in that copper, the resins release their flavour. It also sterilises the wort, makes beer safe to drink. And in the days when there was no safe water to drink, people drank beer for breakfast, felt happy all day. The brewer's important decision is which variety of hops should he use, and in what quantity. Not all hops are added as you've seen. They can be powdered and then compressed into small pellets. That's just for convenience. This is a pretty modern copper using pelleted hops in the preparation of lager. The wort circulates unceasingly as it boils. It's a kind of enclosed whirlpool. The whirlpool movement also extracts the spent hops at the end of the boiling, although this is usually done in a separate vessel. The wort is now drawn off to be cooled before fermentation. Up to this stage, all beers are brewed essentially in the same way. Of course, every brewer has his own individual recipe. Subtle differences of the blend of cereals and malt and hops, adding natural sugars to the wort, minor differences in the temperature of the mash. But the real difference comes with the next stage, the fermentation. And the stuff that makes all the difference is this: brewer's yeast. You cannot ferment without it. It is a natural living organism, and it turns the sugars in the wort into alcohol. And so in the fermentation, all the elements are now blended together to produce the unique flavour that is beer. There are two fundamental kinds of fermentation. One is mostly used for lager, the other mostly for ale. We'll take ale first, the traditional British beer. First, the wort is cooled to about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Then it is transferred to special fermentation tanks. Then the yeast is added. It's called pitching. Every brewery will have its own strains, and their purity and quality are zealously guarded. Ale will ferment quite happily in open tanks. The foam you see here is simply caused by pouring. That will soon die down. For the first 24 hours, there is little sign of fermentation, but the yeast is already at work, multiplying itself. The variety of yeast used will affect the flavour of the beer. Soon the yeast cells feed on the sugars in the wort. They turn these sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide. During fermentation, which lasts about 3 days or so with ale, the temperature of the brew will rise naturally by about 10 degrees Fahrenheit. In the traditional process, the multiplying yeast collects at the top of the brew. That's why the process is often called top fermentation. Yeast multiplies itself 5 or 6 times during fermentation, so from time to time, surplus yeast is skimmed off. During fermentation in this particular brewery, the brew is regularly roused to help it absorb oxygen. And in the traditional process too, when the main fermentation is over, a thin crust of yeast will be left for a time. This crust protects the beer from contamination as it starts to mature. This is a different kind of fermentation room, and the obvious difference is that the tanks are enclosed. They are brewing lager here, and the control of the temperature is critical, which is one reason for the enclosed tanks. Another is that it's more cost-effective for the brewer, a third that they're easier to clean. Lager must ferment at a lower temperature than ale, something below 10 degrees centigrade, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and the temperature must be consistent. So these tanks are refrigerated to hold the temperature down, and that means that the fermentation takes longer and the electricity bills are bigger. There is another difference, the yeast. Ale yeast collects at the top, lager yeast collects at the bottom, so they call it bottom fermentation. That is why many tanks for fermenting lager have a conical bottom rather than a flat one. It makes it easier to remove the yeast. Some of the yeast will be reused by the brewer. The rest is taken up by health food industries and by farmers for animal foods. And yeast is not only good for you, it tastes good, if you like beer. All beer must be allowed to mature after fermentation. In bulk, this is done in special maturation vessels at a low, consistent temperature. Lager, which has already taken longer to ferment than ale, needs longer to mature as well, and needs more refrigeration at this stage too. In this maturation room, some of the lagers will stay for 7 weeks or so. It is one of the reasons why lager is a bit more expensive to brew than ales. At all stages of brewing, the mixture must be sampled and tested. Breweries have dedicated laboratories to ensure that all stages of the brewing process are achieving the specified standards. Here, the traditional craft of the brewer is confirmed by the analytical skills of the chemist. What happens to the beer now depends upon how it will be drunk. Draft ales may be run directly into barrels. They can even have some dry hops added for extra aroma. Beers like this will come into condition in the pub cellar, so they're called cask conditioned. Other beer is often brought to condition on site and then filtered before racking into barrels. This means that the beer is ready for drinking as soon as it reaches the pub. It is called bright beer or brewery-conditioned beer. The majority of lagers are brewery-conditioned. So too are ales for kegging. It's bright beer which is the beer generally used for bottling and canning. Bottled and canned beer has to have a reasonable shelf life, so the beer will be pasteurized once in its container as further guard against deterioration. Pasteur conducted some of his early experiments in London breweries. Other beers, those going into kegs or the plastic PET bottles, are pasteurized before going into their containers. So the beers brewed here are dispatched all over the country, not just in casks, but in bottles and cans and packs. In fact, in no fewer than 120 different ways. And that's just from one brewery. If you add all the breweries in Britain together, you get 1,000 different products. But they are all beer. And the brewers like to know which are to your taste. In spite of all the scientific knowledge and control, all the technological wizardry of the brewery engineers, the final assessment of any beer is a personal one. All breweries sample their beers, comparing young with old. The bigger breweries have regular panels of experts, and daily tastings and markings.
Very acceptable. It's there. Yes, there. Yeah, very acceptable.
They must be the only beer drinkers in Britain to throw away more than they drink. For the rest of us, well, we ask only, what does it taste like? We each have our favourite pub, our favourite flavour. For the craft of the brewer is still very much alive. It hasn't been made irrelevant by the developments in science and technology, just more consistent, more precise. Technology is brewing's servant, not its master. The processes of brewing are natural ones, using natural products, and the industry is a food industry, far more closely tied to the land and farming than most others. That first ancient brewer didn't invent the process. He stumbled upon it, happening in nature, lucky chap. And we have been drinking to him ever since. You know, I think I deserve another one.